We are back this week, UFC Vegas 54 betting and DraftKings show. I'm Jon Kelly. Let's hear the picks. In our first fight of the night, we have Nick Maximoff coming in as a minus 380 favorite. The comeback on Andrea Petrovsky is plus 290. And this is a really fun matchup because both guys come from a wrestling background. Both of them wrestled collegiately. And I expect both of them to want to get this fight to the mat, more so on the Maximoff side, because I do think Petrovsky, while his striking is stiff and a little bit awkward, he clearly does have power. And I do think he's probably the more polished striker of the two. However, I think Maximoff is going to be able to get him to the ground. It might be difficult early in the fight, but if there's anything we know about Maximoff, he is super aggressive and relentless with that wrestling pace. Landed 8 takedowns in his last fight. He averages just under 5 takedowns per 15 minutes. I do think he'll be able to get this fight to the ground, especially as the fight goes on and Petrovsky's cardio tends to fade, because that's Petrovsky's biggest issue is the gas tank, right? Like we saw him fade on The Ultimate Fighter, got choked out by Brian Battle. We've seen him fade a couple times in the UFC. He's definitely started to slow down. He ended up getting those wins, but the level of competition certainly wasn't there. And in both of those, he definitely had a grappling advantage, which I don't think he's going to have here against Nick Maximoff. So I think it's going to be closer than this big line would indicate, but I do think Maximoff lands multiple takedowns here and probably gets his hand raised. So I like Maximoff. The pick is Maximoff. In terms of DraftKings, I am going to target some Petrovsky on the other side just because, like I said, Maximoff's striking defense is not great and Petrovsky does have power, but I'm really just betting on the better wrestler, in my opinion, the more credentialed grappler, Maximoff being the black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and the guy with the better gas tank. So we're going Maximoff. Even though the price is wide, I think he gets it done on Saturday. We have UFC newcomer Tatsuro Tyra going up against Carlos Candelario. Tyra, the big favorite at minus 250. The comeback on Candelario is plus 200. And this one is an interesting matchup because both guys are relatively green. Tyra obviously coming in with a lot of hype. He's a 10-0 prospect. 8 of his wins have come inside the distance. And really, when you watch his fights, yes, they came against lower level competition, but he does have at least some tools we can get excited about. He's got some good back takes. His striking is not great. He's very low volume, super patient on the feet, probably too patient. But when he does let his strikes go, he sits on his strikes quite a bit, like especially those leg kicks. He looks to attack the legs of his opponents, but he is really throwing everything into those strikes. So when he does throw, we know he's throwing with power. And then in terms of Candelario, you know, he fought on Dana White Contender Series. Came in on short notice, fought Victor Altamirano in what was a very close split decision. A lot of people thought he might have won that fight. Decent account for himself, but he's a guy that I just don't think is really all that good in any area. Like he's pretty solid, should have a striking advantage here, probably the better wrestler, but I do think he could be potentially in danger on the mat with Tyra, who I think is the better submission grappler in this matchup. For that reason, I don't really have a strong take. I do think the line is probably a little bit wide here, but I actually do favor the upside of Tyra, especially in terms of DraftKings, because I just think the ceiling is much, much higher. The problem is the price, because he's such a sizable favorite. He really needs that early first or second round finish to pay off his tag. So there are definitely some questions here. I'm going to have exposure to both sides because I am treating Candelario as a live underdog in this spot. I'm just not sure how much I want to get exposure to this fight. So I'll have some of both sides, probably heavier on the underdog, but no bet for me on the first fight of the night. Up next, we have Virna Jandiroba going up against Angela Hill. And so far, this is my biggest bet of the night. I bet Virna Jandiroba on FanDuel at minus 150. The market has certainly moved in her favor, but I do agree with that market movement. She's now a minus 180 favorite. Angela Hill on the comeback at plus 155. And the reason why I favor Jandiroba in this matchup is because, for starters, I do think she's going to clearly have a wrestling advantage in this matchup. Angela Hill, I've given credit to her in the past. Her takedown defense has come a long way. She was able to stuff the majority of Michelle Waterson's takedowns. We've seen it improve over the last few fights. However, I do think Jandiroba is sort of that next tier up in terms of wrestling, and I think there's just going to be a massive grappling advantage in this fight. Angela Hill, we know, struggles to defend submissions, so when she is taken down, I do think Jandiroba is liable to find a submission. But I just keep going back to Jandiroba gets the fight to the ground. So even if she doesn't find a sub, I do think she banks enough control time, and I think the takedowns are going to be there. So I think she gets her hand raised. So I actually have a decent amount of interest in Jandiroba on DraftKings. She's priced at 8,500. I think she has solid upside at that price, because if she gets a takedown early on Angela Hill, she may just sub her instantly. We've seen Angela Hill get submitted by Randa Marcos a few years back, and that was a round one submission. So it certainly wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility here. I do like Jandiroba here. I'm pretty confident on Jandiroba's side, and I think she gets her hand raised on Saturday. Next fight up, we have Michael Johnson, comes in as a -150 favorite. The comeback on Alan Patrick is +130, and this is a matchup where I expect Michael Johnson to have a pretty clear striking advantage. His footwork, his speed, his power, I think that all plays into his side of this matchup. Alan Patrick on the other side is clearly going to want to get this fight to the ground. He's more of a grappler, averages around 2 takedowns per 15 minutes. He has a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The problem is the gas tank has never really been there for him, and now he's knocking on the door of 40 years old, which I don't put a ton of confidence in fighters at the lower weight divisions who are starting to get up there in age. But also Michael Johnson, I have concerns about him. Like, I wouldn't say I'm super confident in him. He's on a 4-fight losing streak, and a lot of people expected him, myself included, to beat Clay Guida, keep the fight standing for the majority. That's what he has to do in this matchup. He wasn't able to do it against Clay Guida. I'm not fully convinced he's going to be able to do it against Alan Patrick, but I do think the cardio of Alan Patrick is much, much worse than Clay Guida here. So I think that can kind of play into Michael Johnson's favor as the fight goes on. If he is able to weather the early storm in the takedowns, round 2 and round 3, I think we start to see it widen in his favor and possibly even get a late stoppage here. So I like Michael Johnson. I'm not super confident in it, but I do think he's probably the right side here. And I'm not fully going to fade Alan Patrick just because he does have grappling upside in a victory. But overall, I think there's just better fights to target on this slate. Next fight up is Andrea Lee, -120 favorite. The comeback on Viviana Araujo is +100. And this is another bet for me. I bet Andrea Lee earlier in the week at -115 for a unit. I just think Andrea Lee, while the fight should be pretty competitive here, I think she has a lot more intangibles going in her favor. For starters, Viviana Araujo, she's powerful, she comes out aggressive, she has a solid wrestling base, and she looks pretty good early in the fight, but time and time again, we see her start to slow down after the first round. And when you're fighting someone like Andrea Lee, who we know is always going to give 110% out there, she does have solid cardio, she is going to keep fighting into the third round if she needs to. I think that's going to be a problem here in a fight that I expect to be pretty competitive early. I think Andrea Lee's probably the more well-rounded striker. She's got a strong jab. She could fight behind her jab, stay on the outside, stick and move. I think all of those things can work for her in this matchup. And then you talk about the wrestling. I do think there's a little bit of risk that she could get stuck on bottom early in this fight, but I doubt Viviana Araujo is going to have the gas tank and the muscle to be able to do that for 15 minutes to Andrea Lee, who I think is just the more well-rounded of the two, and she's on a 2-fight win streak. She's finished both of those fights as well. I think she's kind of surging right now. She had a few losses in a row there. A couple of them were robbery split decisions. She seems like she's coming into her own here, and I just want to back the fighter who I know is going to give 110%. Better cardio, better durability, and I think is just the more well-rounded fighter kind of coming into her own. So I bet Andrea Lee here for a unit at -115. I think she gets her hand raised on Saturday, but in terms of DraftKings, I'm probably not going to target this fight too much. Next fight up, we have a fun matchup in the flyweight division as Jake Hadley takes on Alan Nascimento. Hadley comes in as a -210 favorite. The comeback on Nascimento is +175. Jake Hadley fought on Dana White Contender Series this past season. He's really got a solid wrestling base. He's a very slick submission grappler as well. 4 of his 8 wins have come by submission. But against Alan Nascimento, this is a guy who's never been submitted in his entire career. 13 of his 17 professional wins have come by submission. So he's a tricky grappler in his own right. The problem is Nascimento is way too willing to give up that position and end up on his back. We've seen it in the UFC now twice. He's been taken down on 5 of 6 attempts across his 2 UFC fights, and he lost both of those by split decision. A couple of times you were wondering if he won a round off of his back just because he's constantly doing things off of his back, whether it's elbows, whether it's looking to sweep, looking for submissions off his back as well. So I do think there's going to be a lot of fun grappling exchanges here, but I'm almost always going to favor the guy who I expect to be in the more dominant position as long as he's a competent grappler. And I do think Jake Hadley is. So I'm not convinced Hadley subs him here, but I do think he's going to land multiple takedowns and bank enough control time to probably get his hand raised. But this is a fight where I am considering Nascimento is a live underdog here. We've seen it time and time again. Those Dana White Contender Series fighters come in as a sizable favorite. They end up losing in their debut. Hell, we just saw it last week with Fernie Garcia. And obviously this matchup is totally different, but it just goes back to the thing is like, it is his UFC debut. He puts a lot of pressure on himself. He thinks he's like a future champ type material, talks a lot of smack, has mostly been able to back it up. But I just think it's a kind of difficult matchup for him, being that it's his first fight in the UFC. I think he gets his hand raised, but I'm not like fully confident in that. So I'm going to be targeting both sides on DraftKings. Next fight up, we have another Dana White Contender Series prospect, Manuel Torres, making his UFC debut. He fought this past season on Dana White Contender Series, won by first round knockout. He is 12-2 professionally. Both of his losses have come by submission. And a fun fact is he's actually only been out of the first round once in his entire career across 14 professional fights. So he is certainly looking to get you out of there early. The cardio is entirely unproven, but he does have power. He fights behind his jab pretty well. He's lengthy. He uses his length, and he starts out pretty fast trying to get you out of there. So against Frank Camacho, I think Camacho is going to be a willing dance partner. Camacho has power himself. We've seen him stop multiple guys in the first round as well, but he's actually coming off a first round knockout loss against Justin James. Bit of a rough patch here in the UFC, and it's not because he doesn't still have it in him. It's just because the level of competition that he's faced has been pretty tough as of late. He's lost 4 of his last 5 fights. But again, going back to the power, 17 of his 22 wins have come by knockout. Obviously, Torres, I talked about his power as well. I think this is a high variance fight where either guy can finish, and I do think it probably finishes early. So for that reason, it's another one of those fights where you probably want exposure to both sides on DraftKings, depending on how many lineups you're making. But I'm going to side with the debutante fighter. I know I just talked about the Dana White Contender Series fade and all that, but I do think he's powerful. I trust his durability a little bit more at this stage in his career, and I just think he could potentially do exactly what Justin James did and get Frank Camacho out of there. So we're going with Torres by knockout, but again, I will have shares of both sides. This is just both guys are priced in the mid-range. It's a high variance fight. Either guy can finish. I'm going to lean with Torres, but it's not a confident lean. Next fight up, we have Katlyn Chookagian going against my girl Amanda Ribas here. Chookagian comes in as a -170 favorite. The comeback on Amanda Ribas is +150. And originally early in the week, I thought I would be backing Amanda Ribas here, and I still am considering it, but I'm probably not going to unless I get, better than +150, which is out there right now. So I'm still going back and forth on it, but I do think there's some aspects of this fight where I want to back Amanda Ribas. I do think she has wrestling upside, grappling upside as well, but there's obvious concerns on the Ribas side as well. For starters, she's never been, super durable. She's kind of chinny. She's been knocked out twice in her career. She was rocked against Ferna Jandiroba in her last fight, and yes, she recovered, won the next 2 rounds, ended up getting her hand raised, but this is the first time she's moving up to 125 here, and she wasn't like this massive 115er, so I do think she could struggle with the size aspect. Katlyn Chookagian is going to be much taller. She's going to have a 2-inch reach advantage, so if Ribas isn't able to mix in that wrestling and muscle Chookagian to the ground, then I could see her just getting stuck at range where I don't think she's dead by any means, but I do think we could see a typical Katlyn Chookagian decision where she wins 29-28 or even 30-27 just on the basis of throwing a ton of empty volume out there, making her tennis court sounds, and the judges just absolutely eat it up. They think it's such a dominant round by her, even though she's not actually landing a ton of damage. So I'm not a big fan of her in this matchup or just in general, because I think she's a little bit overrated. But on the Ribas side, I think there's just a little bit too many concerns is the reason why it's given me some pause on backing Ribas. In terms of DraftKings, I do think Ribas has much more upside in a victory, just because if she does win, it's likely coming by multiple takedowns or even potentially a finish on the mat. But ultimately, I think this one goes the full 15 minutes where maybe Chookagian edges it out and the judges think that she absolutely dominated. So Chookagian by decision is the official pick, but I'll have little to none of her depending on how many lineups I'll make, and I will definitely have exposure to the underdog in Amanda Hebos. And next up in the bantamweight division, we have Davy Grant coming in as a -300 favorite against Louis Smolka on the comeback at +235. And this is a spot where, similar to the first fight of the evening, I'm expecting this to be a pretty high variance fight where I favor Davy Grant as the favorite, but I do think the price gap is just too wide here. You know, on the Smolka side, since moving up to 135 pounds, he hasn't had a ton of success. He knocked out Ryan McDonald, since been cut by the UFC, and a dusty Jose Quinones, who now his durability is kind of going. So I don't put a ton of stock into that, but he does have finishing ability, and you can't ignore that. That's why you can't fully ignore Louis Smolka, because he is a finisher. He's completely untrustworthy, but he does have finishing upside. So in a fight against Davy Grant, who typically has, you know, that brawler mentality, Davy Grant hits hard. He's going to be winging those powerful hooks. He'll mix in the takedowns as well. He's not really a control guy on the mat, but 8 of his 13 wins have come by submission, and Smolka's got a couple submissions up his sleeve as well. So I think this is one where either guy can finish. I favor Grant just because I trust him a little bit more in terms of being a better minute winner, and I trust his durability just a little bit more as well. But I definitely think Smolka's a live underdog in this spot. I think the price is pretty wide here. I'm probably going to have more exposure to the underdog, Smolka, in DraftKings, just because I do think he has a little bit more upside where both guys can finish. Davy Grant probably has to finish to pay off his salary on DraftKings. And next fight up, we have Ian Cutelaba coming in as a -220 favorite. The comeback on Ryan Spann is +180. And this is a fight that I'm very excited about. First off, I'm a big Cutelaba fan. I just like his personality. I like his fighting style. He has that combat sambo background, but he's super powerful, and he typically comes out of the gate early and tries to get you out of there. 12 of his 16 wins have come by knockout. The majority of them have been inside the first round. And then on the Spawn side, like, he's a finisher himself. 16 of his 19 wins have come inside the distance. I expect him to bring the fight to Cutelaba. The problem is the durability. Ryan Spann's been knocked out 3 times in his career. He's been finished in 5 of his 7 losses, and the durability is just not there. Every time this guy gets hit clean, he's rocked. He's doing the chicken dance. Like, yes, he's been knocked out 3 times, but we've seen him hurt in almost every single one of his fights. And I do think Cutelaba, pretty much the first time he connects clean on Spann, I think he's going for the kill, and I think he gets him out of there. I'm expecting a first-round knockout by Ian Cutelaba. Cutelaba is my poster boy this week on the thumbnail. He's my favorite play on DraftKings this week, and a main event, which we'll get to, that you don't necessarily have to target. I think Cutelaba is the best play this week at 8,900 on DraftKings. I just think the first round knockout or finish upside is relatively high, and he also has that high-paced wrestling nature to fall back on. We've seen him land multiple takedowns inside of 1 round before, and I think he can do that here if he elects to. But I do think he probably just knocks out Spann early, gets the first round TKO. So we're going with Cutelaba to get his hand raised here, and like I said, he's my favorite play this week on DraftKings. And speaking of the main event, we have Alexander Rakic coming in as a sizable favorite, -195 against Jan Blachowicz, former light heavyweight champion, on the comeback at +165. And this is one where I kind of think people are sleeping on Jan Blachowicz a little bit too much, or certainly the market is at +165. We'll see if the money starts to keep moving in Rakic's favor, but I really think that Jan Blachowicz is a live underdog in this spot. This is a guy who beat Israel Adesanya in a striking match over 25 minutes, one that I did not expect him to win. And obviously the size was a huge factor in that matchup. He's probably going to be a little bit smaller than Alexander Rakic, so it's certainly different. However, I think Rockett, I've been high on him as a prospect, but I just think he's getting a little bit too much love too soon. You know, we've seen him at times just be a little stagnant. He doesn't put a ton of volume out there. He fought Thiago Santos in a fight that basically nothing happened over 15 minutes. And obviously, when he looks to wrestle, he looks pretty solid. But the problem is he doesn't mix in the grappling much. You know, he's a good control grappler, but he doesn't really land takedowns. Averages less than 1 takedown per 15 minutes. So I'm not sure if he's going to come in here and just be able to blanket Jan Blachowicz like Glover Teixeira was able to do to strip the belt from him. So I do have concerns on the Rakic side. He's obviously got the power. He's got the kicks. Super powerful guy. But we've seen him rocked and wobbled as well. The Devin Clark fight comes to mind, and now you're going up against a guy, the Polish Power. They call him that for a reason, because he's won multiple fights by knockout recently. I think the power in terms of the boxing, I think the power favors Jan Blachowicz here, and I actually just think he's probably just a little bit more well-rounded at this stage in his career. I think it's too much too soon for Rockett, so I'm actually backing the underdog here in Jan Blachowicz. I think he gets his hand raised in what is likely the #1 contender spot for the light heavyweight strap. And remember, there's only 11 fights this week on DraftKings, so it's going to be a lot different than the 15 fight slate that we had last week for the big pay-per-view. So just keep that in mind in terms of roster construction. I'll have ownership projections up on my website, fightnumbers.com, so you can see who's probably going to be the more chalky fighters, identify some possible leverage spots as well. I'll also have my DraftKings player rankings broken down by salary tier, which helps out, and all of it's completely free. Check it out, fightnumbers.com. Appreciate it, guys. Best of luck this Saturday, and we'll see you next time.